The 16th of March, 1968. Quảng Ngãi Province, South Vietnam. 3 years after the United States entered the Vietnam War, soldiers from Charlie Company of the 11th Infantry Brigade, Americal Division, are deployed to the village of My Lai to eliminate the suspected Viet Cong guerrillas, South Vietnamese communist insurgents supported by North Vietnam, who are believed to be hiding in the region. The US troops land by helicopters expecting resistance, but instead encounter unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. What follows will send shockwaves through the US political establishment, the military's chain of command, and an already divided American public. Over the next several hours, the soldiers round up and murder hundreds of civilians, burn their homes, and wipe out entire settlements. This atrocity, the largest mass killing of civilians by US forces in the 20th century, becomes known as the My Lai Massacre. Starting in the mid-19th century, Vietnam gradually came under French colonial rule, and by 1887 it was fully incorporated into French Indochina. During the Second World War, which began on the 1st of September 1939, it was invaded by Japan. In response, a nationalist and communist-led resistance known as the Viet Minh, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, began fighting for Vietnam's independence. The Second World War in the Pacific ended on the 2nd of September 1945, and after Japan's surrender, Ho Chi Minh declared the country's independence and took control of Hanoi. However, the French soon returned in an attempt to reassert their colonial rule, sparking a bloody conflict which became known as First Indochina War and lasted nearly a decade. In May 1954, the French were decisively defeated at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which forced them to negotiate peace. At the Geneva Conference that same year, it was agreed that Vietnam would be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, with North Vietnam, officially the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh's communist government, and South Vietnam under the leadership of the anti-communist Emperor Bao Dai, until nationwide elections could be held. But those elections never took place. Instead, Bao Dai was eventually ousted in a referendum in 1955 by Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, who was supported by the United States, and from the 26th of October 1955 served as the first president of South Vietnam, officially called the Republic of Vietnam. The country remained divided. In the north, Ho Chi Minh consolidated a communist state, while in the south, Diem's regime was backed by the West. However, he became increasingly unpopular with his own people, many of whom resented his corruption, his refusal to implement land reform, and his hostility towards the Buddhist majority. Opposition in the south continued to grow, and by the late 1950s, communist insurgents known as the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, began launching attacks with support from the north. Their goal was to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. At the same time, the United States, deeply entrenched in Cold War thinking, feared the spread of communism across Southeast Asia. American leaders subscribed to the domino theory, the belief that if South Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. With China turning communist in 1949 and North Vietnam firmly under Ho Chi Minh's control, Washington grew increasingly alarmed. Under Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy, the US sent money, equipment, and military advisors to bolster Diem's government. By 1963, around 16,000 American advisors were in Vietnam. But Diem's growing repression, particularly against Buddhists, triggered mass unrest. Eventually, his regime was overthrown in a coup and Diem was assassinated, with at least silent US approval. Yet instead of bringing stability, his removal created a political vacuum in the South. A critical turning point came in early August 1964, when US naval vessels patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin were involved in 2 incidents with North Vietnamese forces. On the 2nd of August, the USS Maddox engaged with North Vietnamese torpedo boats in what was later confirmed as a real clash. Just 2 days later, a second attack was reported, but the evidence was dubious and clouded by poor weather conditions. Despite this uncertainty, the Johnson administration presented the second incident as fact. The U.S. Congress quickly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Lyndon Johnson sweeping authority to escalate American involvement without a formal declaration of war. Key details were withheld, including the fact that South Vietnamese forces had been conducting provocative raids on the north. By 1965, the first major deployments of U.S. ground troops arrived, and what had begun as a mission to support an ally quickly turned into a full-scale war. Over the next few years, the American presence surged, with over 500,000 troops in Vietnam by 1968. The war was draining the U.S. economy, costing as much as $77 billion a year, roughly $670 billion in today's money, and public support was beginning to crumble, both at home and among soldiers on the ground. It was in this charged atmosphere that Charlie Company arrived in South Vietnam in December 1967, and during their first 3 months in the country, they had not engaged directly with Viet Cong or North Vietnamese forces. Instead, they suffered 28 casualties, mostly caused by mines and booby traps hidden along rural trails and rice paddies. These losses, though not from open battles, took a heavy psychological toll on the young and inexperienced soldiers. Frustration, fear, and a growing resentment toward the Vietnamese civilian population began to build. Intelligence reports pointed to My Lai, a village located near the central coast of South Vietnam, as a suspected stronghold of the Viet Cong's 48th Battalion, believed to be behind many of the attacks on U.S. troops in the area. Captain Ernest Medina, the company's commanding officer, gave direct orders to sweep the village thoroughly and told his men to destroy anything that was walking, crawling, or growling. When asked who was considered the enemy, he reportedly replied, "Anybody that was running from us, hiding from us, or appeared to be the enemy. If a man was running, shoot him. Sometimes even if a woman with a rifle was running, shoot her." When asked if this included unarmed women and children, Medina stated, "They're all Viet Cong. Now go and get them." With these orders in mind, and shaped by weeks of tension and loss, Charlie Company entered the village of My Lai on the morning of the 16th of March, 1968. What unfolded in My Lai became one of the most horrifying atrocities of the Vietnam War. Instead of encountering armed Viet Cong fighters, the soldiers of Charlie Company were met by unarmed civilians, women, children, and elderly men. Many of them were preparing food or carrying out mourning routines. These villagers did not resist or attempt to flee. Some stood passively, confused by the sudden presence of the Americans. The killings began abruptly. One machine gunner later recalled seeing a fellow soldier stab a villager with a bayonet. Then the same soldier shoved an elderly man into a well and dropped a grenade in after him. Nearby, a group of about 15 to 20 people, mostly women and children, were seen kneeling around a small temple. They were praying, crying, and holding incense sticks. And without any warning, they were all executed with shots to the head. Elsewhere in the village, large groups of civilians were rounded up. Under the orders of Lieutenant William Calley, who was in charge of one of the 3 platoons that Charlie Company consisted of, around 70 to 80 villagers were herded to the edge of an irrigation ditch. Calley, shouting instructions, ordered his men to open fire. He personally joined in the shooting, and the civilians, many of them women holding children, were mowed down in cold blood. One of the most chilling moments came when Calley approached a woman who was clutching an infant. He seized her by the hair and shot her in the head with his .45 caliber pistol. Then, standing over the crying baby she had been holding, he coldly aimed and murdered the child as well. Captain Ernest Medina, the commanding officer of Charlie Company, was also present in the village. While he would later claim that he was unaware of the scale of the killings, testimony from multiple soldiers placed him at the scene of several murders. One man remembered seeing Medina shoot a wounded woman who posed no threat. Throughout the village, atrocities were carried out in every direction. Soldiers used bayonets to stab civilians, executed the wounded with pistols, and even used grenade launchers on groups of villagers. One soldier, reportedly frustrated that he had not yet fired his weapon, gathered several women and children into a small group, stepped back, and then launched explosive rounds into them. Others went hut to hut, setting homes on fire, killing livestock, and gunning down anyone they encountered. The roads, yards, and fields were soon littered with corpses, some shot, others mutilated. Some victims had the signature C Company carved into their chests. One soldier would testify later. "I cut their throats, cut off their hands, cut out their tongues, scalped them. I did it. A lot of people were doing it, and I just followed. I lost all sense of direction." Army photographer Ronald Ridenhour, who was embedded with the unit, documented the massacre using his personal camera. His uncensored color photographs would later provide haunting visual evidence of the crime. Ridenhour described witnessing women and children being killed indiscriminately, corpses piling up in ditches and on the roadsides, and one soldier riding a water buffalo while stabbing it repeatedly with his bayonet. He watched in horror as an elderly man, yelling, "No Viet Cong! No Viet Cong!" was gunned down alongside two small children. Sexual violence was also widespread. At least 20 Vietnamese women and girls were raped during the massacre. The victims ranged in age from 10 to 45, and at least 9 of them were under 18. Some of the assaults were committed in front of other soldiers. There were cases of gang rape, and in several incidents, the women were mutilated and murdered immediately afterward. By the time the massacre ended, roughly 3 hours after it began, as many as 504 Vietnamese civilians had been killed. Among the dead were 50 children aged 3 or younger, 69 between the ages of 4 and 7, and 27 elderly victims in their 70s or 80s. The death toll could have been even higher if not for the extraordinary actions of Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, a 24-year-old helicopter pilot on a helicopter patrol over My Lai. As Thompson and his crew, door gunner Lawrence Colburn and crew chief Glenn Andriotta, surveyed the village from above, they quickly noticed disturbing scenes unfolding below. Civilians appeared to be shot at close range, and bodies were piling up near ditches and huts. Circling back over a trench filled with corpses, they spotted faint movement. Hoping to assist survivors, Thompson landed near the ditch and approached a sergeant on the ground, later identified as David Mitchell. When Thompson asked if they could help evacuate the wounded, Mitchell reportedly replied that he would help them out of their misery. Shocked by the brutality, Thompson confronted Lieutenant William Calley and asked if medical assistance could be provided to the wounded civilians. Calley reportedly replied that a hand grenade was the only method he had for their evacuation. As Thompson lifted off again, he looked back and saw Mitchell open fire into the ditch, shooting at survivors. Moments later, the helicopter crew witnessed Captain Ernest Medina kicking an unarmed woman before shooting her at point-blank range. Believing more lives were in immediate danger, Thompson noticed a group of villagers taking cover in a nearby bunker as U.S. troops moved toward them. He quickly landed the helicopter between the soldiers and the civilians and instructed his crew that if the Americans began firing, they were to return fire in defense of the villagers. Thompson then approached a lieutenant, later identified as Stephen Brooks, and informed him there were women and children inside. When Brooks answered that the only way to get them out was with a grenade, Thompson insisted he would handle it himself. He coaxed between 12 and 16 civilians from the bunker and personally stood guard as they were evacuated in 2 helicopter trips. Returning to the area once more, the crew spotted movement in another ditch. Specialist Glenn Andriotta climbed down and emerged with a wounded but alive 4-year-old girl who was flown to safety. Upon returning to base with his helicopter, Thompson reported to his section leader, "It's mass murder out there. They're rounding them up and herding them in ditches and then just shooting them." He then added, "In their slaughter of innocent civilians, the American infantry is no different from the Nazis." What happened at My Lai remained hidden for over a year, largely due to an institutional effort to suppress the truth. It was only after soldier and aspiring journalist Ronald Ridenhour learned about the massacre and wrote a letter to Congress and the Pentagon that an official investigation began. Journalist Seymour Hersh later broke the story to the public in November 1969, and Ronald Ridenhour's photographs appeared soon after in the press, all over the country. The visual evidence, paired with first-hand accounts, ignited public outrage and further eroded support for the Vietnam War. In the wake of the scandal, the Army launched an extensive investigation under the direction of Lieutenant General William R. Pierce. The Pierce Commission collected testimony from hundreds of witnesses and confirmed that war crimes had been committed, including mass murder, rape, and the cover-up that followed. In total, 28 officers and enlisted men were recommended for prosecution. But in the end, only 14 were formally charged. And of those, only one, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. In 1971, Calley was found guilty of the premeditated murder of 22 Vietnamese civilians and sentenced to life in prison. However, President Richard Nixon later commuted the sentence, and Calley served just 3.5 years under house arrest. Captain Medina was court-martialed but acquitted of all charges. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, the helicopter pilot who intervened to stop further killings, initially faced criticism and cold treatment from many within the military. For years, his actions were downplayed or ignored. Congressman Mendel Rivers, then chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, went as far as calling him a traitor and saying he should be prosecuted for threatening to fire on fellow American troops. However, in 1998, Thompson was formally awarded the Soldier's Medal, the U.S. Army's highest decoration for bravery not involving direct contact with the enemy, in recognition of his courage at My Lai. On the 30th of April 1975, the Vietnam War finally came to an end with the fall of Saigon as North Vietnamese forces captured the South Vietnamese capital. The long and brutal conflict left Vietnam devastated. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million Vietnamese civilians and over 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters were killed, along with more than 250,000 South Vietnamese troops. On the American side, around 58,000 soldiers lost their lives. Of the 2.6 million Americans who served in Vietnam, an estimated 1 to 1.6 million saw direct or repeated combat. By 1982, around 60,000 veterans had committed suicide or died from drug overdoses. The war also left deep scars on American society, fueling political divisions, widespread distrust in government, and a national reckoning over the morality of the conflict. The trauma endured by the revelations of atrocities like My Lai challenged the U.S. public's faith in its military and leadership for decades to come. Thanks for watching the World History Channel. Be sure to like and subscribe and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss our next episodes. We thank you, and we'll see you next time on the channel.